Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Matt Rojansky. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and very pleased to welcome all of you and to welcome our three outstanding panelists for a retrospective discussion of Russia's regional elections this past Sunday, September 13th. Before I get started, I'd like to remind everybody you can stay up to date on our upcoming events and publications via our website. And also follow our two podcasts, Kennan X and our newest podcast, The Russia File, co-hosted by Max Trudolyubov, who's joining us today. You can also find our latest analysis on our blogs, The Russia File and Focus Ukraine. I want to remind everybody at the outset, and I'll try to do so again, that if you have questions for our guests, you can submit them in real time, and I will see them via email at kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet them to @Kennan Institute or post them on the Kennan Institute Facebook page. If you include your name and affiliation with the question, it will simply make it more likely that your question gets asked, so please do that. In order to make the most of the time that we have together, I'm just going to go right into the panel, but I think I will introduce each speaker before they speak. And we're going to begin with Nikolai Petrov. Nikolai is a former Kennan Institute Regional Exchange Scholar in the early 1990s. He's currently a senior research fellow on the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in London and a professor of the political science department at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. His current research at Chatham House involves deconstructing the decision-making process in Putin's Russia, which remains largely hidden from the public eye. And let me add personally that Kolya and I were colleagues when I was at the Carnegie Endowment and he was at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and I learned just a tremendous amount about Russian domestic politics and in particular about the Russian regions with Kolya. And I still harbor somewhere in my future goals to take that driving trip across Russia all the way from European Russia to the Far East, or maybe the other direction, as Solzhenitsyn said he would like to do. I still want to do that, and I want to do it with you, Kolya. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. And I'd like to make just a few general points to start our discussion. And my first point is that these elections used to be very different from any previous ones, and it's not that easy to compare them due to many reasons. There was a pandemic, there was economic crisis, there was constitutional reform, and even Navalny's poisoning. So the general, not to mention Khabarovsk protests and what was and what is going on in Belarus. So the general socio-political background was very different from what it used to be in past. If to evaluate election results, whether they are success story for the Kremlin or not, we should have in mind what exactly the Kremlin did want. And it's understandable that, first of all, it was needed for the Kremlin to demonstrate its control, even at a time of very uneasy, socio-political environment. And there was a test for the new way of voting, which at first has been tried during the voting for the constitutional amendments. It was stamp voting, which led authorities not to avoid any kind of serious observation at the time of elections. These elections used to be the last before the forthcoming elections to the State Duma, which are of special importance for the Kremlin because of this political transformation which is going on. And the Kremlin did try 4 new party projects, and it was needed to understand whether the Kremlin is capable or not to find any counterplay against the smart voting invented by Navalny and tried in several regions during these elections. So there are 2 general components of what can be called the Kremlin's success. First, there was a kind of sterilization of elections in a way which did not allow any probable competitors, even loyal competitors, to participate in majority of races after the Kremlin got very negative experience in 2018 elections. And even in case of the Communist Party, 5 candidates out of 18 gubernatorial races, they were not even registered, in spite of the fact that the Communist Party is the biggest of all, and it would be easier for them to pass through the municipal filter. But even in case of registering communist candidates, the Kremlin was putting pressure in order to avoid any strong candidates, like it happened in Irkutsk region, where last December the strong communist candidate has been pushed out, strong communist governor, and in spite of his desire to participate in elections, he was not allowed to do this. And the one who was registered as communist candidate did not even try to compete with the one backed by Vladimir Putin. It's interesting that in case of 18 gubernatorial races, in half of all cases, there used to be old governors, those who did already serve their first term. And it happened due to the fact that the Kremlin was too busy with pandemic to provide for replacement of at least some of them. So even those who were considered to be pretty weak, and they've been weak not due to the fact of being personally weak, they've been weakened by the Kremlin in 2018, when all governors have been pushed to support wholeheartedly the pension reform. And it did create a pretty understandable negative attitude to them. There was so-called Furgal's effect. Furgal, the former governor of Khabarovsk Krai, had been arrested 2 months ago. And the general idea, I think, was to send a signal to candidates from former political elite of regions not to violate those rules of the game which are imposed by the Kremlin. And in my view, if in case of ordinary voters, Furgal effect did mean that citizens have been disappointed and their idea that something can be changed in result of their voting was not that strong. But in case of regional political elites, it didn't play any serious role. And we've seen several cases when former regional political elites, including, say, former Yaroslavl Governor Lisitsyn and former Tambov Mayor Kosenko, they did participate in elections. And in case of Kosenko, they got electoral victory. What is important is the fact that not only there were gubernatorial races where the Kremlin did manage to get all its appointees elected, there were elections to regional assemblies, and in some cases it's too early to make any final conclusions, but generally speaking, the electoral support of the United Russia is now lower than it used to be in previous elections, which did not come as a surprise. And there were also municipal elections. And this is most interesting part of the story, because there were elections to 12 city councils of regional capitals, including in Novosibirsk, including in Nizhny Novgorod, in big cities, where it's much more complicated for authorities to, falsify results. And in 3 cases out of them, in Novosibirsk, in Tomsk, and in Tambov, it's possible to speak about defeat of the Kremlin-backed candidates. In Novosibirsk, there are two party of powers. Not only there is the United Russia, which dominates at the regional level, but there is the Communist Party, which controls mayoral office in Novosibirsk. So they concluded a deal, and that's why Navalny and his supporters were fighting against both the United Russia and the Communist Party, and they've been pretty much successful in their model of smart voting. So the general conclusion, if to overlook all these victories and failures, could be that in case there was real local activism, and unfortunately it wasn't very typical situation this time. So in case there were real serious politicians who were eager to invest efforts, who were eager to invest money into campaigns, it was possible to fight, it was possible to win against the Kremlin, against the party of power. But in case there was pessimism and not only systemic party, but any other opposition parties did not, compete intensively in elections, the Kremlin did manage to win. I would attract your attention to the fact that in case of gubernatorial elections, in many cases, a result was similar to Lukashenko's result in August, meaning that they've reported about 80% or something in between 70 and 80%. So it was huge. It didn't cause any scandals, any mass protests, but it's understandable that this result has been achieved due to the fact that there were 2 days of absolutely uncontrolled voting when it was possible, and in some regions they got 60% of votes during not the voting day, but during these 2 pre-voting days. What is important, I think, is also the fact that turnout was pretty low. So, and this is another component of the victory for the Kremlin. If turnout is low, then the share of those controlled by administration is higher, and it's much easier to get good numbers in favor of Kremlin-backed candidates. And my last point is connected with new political parties which did appear in these elections. There were 4 parties tried by the Kremlin. It's and 3 of them did manage to win at least some seats in one of regions. And if you do have one regional deputy, then you do not need to gather signatures at the time of elections to the State Duma. So it was very important for them to get these victories. And those regions which were given to them did assist them, except for 2 regions. There was Voronezh and Belgorod, where regional authorities did not help those parties backed by the Kremlin. And perhaps the recent, yesterday's resignation of the long-liver Belgorod governor Evgeny Savchenko, who was the last one appointed not by Putin but by Yeltsin in 1993, can be somehow connected to the fact that he himself and his administration didn't assist the Kremlin to give seats needed to Kremlin-backed parties. So we do have now the Party for the Truth of the writer Zakhar Prilepin. We do have the Party New Men, Novые Люди, backed and financed by the businessman Andrei Nechayev. And we do have party, the Green Alternative. It is considered to be, fighting for ecological issues, and it's backed by well-known painter Vasya Loshkin. So all of them did manage to get 5 to 10% of votes in a few regional races, meaning that they can be used in a year from now at the time of State Duma elections in order to, help the Kremlin to get finally majority the Kremlin needs at the State Duma. However, the problem is connected with the fact that half of mandates should be distributed in single mandate districts, and the technology of smart voting did demonstrate that in big cities, it's quite possible for the opposition, even in case federal leaders of opposition parties do wholeheartedly support the Kremlin, it's possible to make deals with regional activists, and it's possible to find that it's possible to win against Kremlin-backed candidates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kolya. I want to go next to Regina Smyth, who's actually with us now at the Kennan Institute as a fellow, but is normally a professor of political science at Indiana University. Her primary research interest is the dynamics of state-society relations in transitional and electoral authoritarian regimes. She's written extensively on post-Soviet political development in the Russian Federation, focusing precisely on elections, parties, civic initiatives, and the effects of social policy. In her new book, Elections, Protest, and Authoritarian Regime Stability, Russia 2008 to 2020, should be coming out in just a couple of months this year. So Regina, please.
Thanks, Matt. So I want to echo a lot of what Kolya said, but amplify some key points. And I want to start by saying it's hard for me to think of this as an election. While there were pockets of competition and pockets of real give and take, really this is a performance of state competence in one critical area. So we often think of the Russian state as struggling, but here in management of elections, it's really got the system down to a science. So what do we learn from the regime, about the regime from the exercise? It's that its capacity to manufacture votes is very strong. It has an astounding ability to adapt to the conditions across districts and regions and to adjust their strategy across those geographic areas. We also see that in large part, there's not significant elite defection within the system needed to make the electoral management work. So there are a few examples of independence. Nikolai pointed out some of them. We do see elite defection in support of opposition candidates or against very disliked United Russia candidates, but by and large, within the system of electoral management, people are doing their jobs. And it takes a lot of people to fix a contest in this way. But I want to join Nikolai in saying this doesn't necessarily represent the strength of United Russia or its candidates. The numbers aren't about political support, they're about this management system. So the use of elections as a legitimizing force or to win support for responsiveness is growing considerably weaker, so that the system, the entire system is starting to change because of this change in electoral systems. We can talk about specific cases as we go on, but I want to also note that the burden of manufacturing these votes is getting more difficult. And the Kremlin's working harder to secure the same outcomes. Society is looking more and more like a normal electorate, disengaging when things are hopeless or there's no choice, but attentive and ready to engage when there's competition happening. One sign of this work that the Kremlin's doing, but also a sign of weakness in the system, is that we're seeing a big return to Yeltsin-era strategies to limit opposition majorities. So for example, in the by-elections for the State Duma, we see that a bunch of these guys, or there were only 4 races, but 3 of the 4 were not held because someone died, but because the Kremlin pulled unpopular candidates into state bureaucracies, and in place of them nominated celebrities like hockey players and cosmonauts, or people with really close ties to local industry that can turn out the vote. So this is a hearkening back. We see lots of parties on the party list side of the race, so that small parties that don't make it over the threshold create a large seat bonus for United Russia. So if we look at a very conservative region, Kostroma, there are 11 parties on the ballot, with several more that tried to get on but were disqualified, including the 4th Kremlin Project Party run by Putin's nephew. So the percent of votes on the party list race was 31% of the vote for United Russia, but it got 50% of the seats because the small parties didn't get over the hurdle, the threshold, and the seat bonus went to the largest party. This made a real difference for the UR control of the regional legislature, the Obduma, which is really quite small. The last thing they're doing is playing the name game. So there were several versions of communist parties on the ballot, including the KPSS, the Communist Party of Social Justice, and the Communists of Russia. So these Kremlin parties still struggled for support in the lead up to 2021. Nikolai noted that they did surpass the threshold to be able to be on the ballot for parliamentary elections, but not in any sort of authentic way. So we see that most of the votes for these parties came in this stump voting system where elections were unobserved. So that perhaps voters are on to this strategy. So I just wanted to highlight a couple more of the ways in which the Kremlin is managing elections. So Nikolai mentioned turnout. Here the Kremlin has had to tolerate lower and lower turnout in these elections. And also what we see is varying levels of turnout across races in the same district. So gubernatorial turnout was lower than the last round, but higher than legislative turnout. So we see with this in the same region with the same people, different levels of turnout. We see big gaps in who voted in the mobile sites and who voted in the districts. So you have very, very high percentages of voting in the mobile sites relative to the districts in races where there has been trouble. In Arkhangelsk, for example, the level of voting in the gubernatorial race through mobile sites was extremely high relative to districts. This point has been made about urban voting. We also see that the difference in turnout changes depending on monitoring. And in places where there's close monitoring of the elections, we see closer margins and also slightly higher turnout, which suggests that manipulation is being worked through turnout. I want to make a really strong point here that the Kremlin has total control over who runs on these ballots. And it's using this control to manufacture ballots that will produce the outcome it wants. And it's gotten this down to a science. And what we saw in this race as a sign of weakness was the optimal control has been 5 candidates on the ballot, perhaps 6. But in many of these races, you're seeing 10 candidates on the ballot in order to split the opposition vote and have the United Russia candidate come out ahead. In Ulyanovsk, for example, where there was a strong movement, all of the KPRF candidates were not permitted to run. We see a big gap between what's happening in party list race and district races. So again, in Kostroma, United Russia gets 30% of the votes and 16 out of 25 of the seats in single member districts. This shows how ballot manipulation really provides the capacity to shape outcomes even in the face of smart voting. So this control over ballot access is really important. let me just conclude here so we can get to discussion with two ideas. First, it's that the Kremlin does seem aware of danger of creating common knowledge. That is the danger of creating the situation that we observed in Belarus, where a factory worker says, everyone in our shop voted for Tishkanovskaya. How could it be that Lukashenko got 80% of the vote? So we see a very careful management of vote totals across districts where you might have expected an opposition candidate to be successful. They come very close to the United Russia candidate. And then in districts where, or precincts where you would expect the vote to go to United Russia, the numbers are astronomically high, sometimes over 85 and 90% in those precincts, in the gubernatorial races and in the Oblast Duma races. Finally, I want to point out that it's essential to look at what's changing in terms of coalition formation and governments in legislatures after the races. So we would start to expect to see some divisions in Yerol between independent and party deputies, between district and list deputies, and a growing sign of tension or perhaps even strength for the systemic parties, which are now being manhandled in a much more aggressive way than they have been. I also want to point out that the smart voting candidates and the candidates who are voting on these winning on these small parties, many of them are talking to each other. And so in Moscow, we see, for example, smart vote candidates who were supported by Navalny in the election campaign, still in touch with the Navalny organization, getting help from them in terms of legislative writing. So we see here a change that could go beyond just how this election turned out to create new challenges in governance.
Great, thank you so much, Regina. I want to go to Max, but before I do, let me remind you, if you have questions, you can email them to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet @Kennan Institute, or post on our Facebook page, and please include your name and affiliation. So now I'll go to Max Trudolyubov, who's our senior advisor at the Kennan Institute, editor-at-large of Meduza, and previously the editorial page editor of Vedomosti from 2003 to 2015. He's been a contributing opinion writer for the International New York Times since the fall of 2013. He writes the Russia File blog here at the Kennan Institute and has worked to further open and inform political debate in Russia over the past nearly 2 decades in various roles. Max, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you for having me. And really good to see you, everyone, online, unfortunately. But thank you for the great presentations. I think that I cannot stress strongly enough this point that Regina made, that the events that we are discussing, they're called elections, just like any elections in any part of the world. But this is a different thing. This is a very special administrative procedure whose purpose is different from the elections that happen in the States, in Germany, and France, Argentina, Japan, any other country where access to being elected is more open, let's say. The idea, essentially, the Kremlin's idea is that it's important to manage the process of who gets to the ballot, who gets registered as a candidate, who can access politics, even symbolically, despite the fact that most of the elected officials, they have really limited roles. We also have to understand that. The municipal deputies, very limited roles. Even the deputies in the Duma, the Russian parliament, They have a very limited scope for decision making, and governors, probably the most politically active and potent figures in Russia. But again, access to being elected, selected, I would say, as a governor, is highly, very closely managed by the presidential administration, by the people who have never been elected. So the process of being elected is managed by people who have never been elected in the first place. The second thing that I want to point out, I think, is that since time I've been watching this, there were two competing views of how Russia's political process, or where the Russian political process is going, which way. Is it gradually moving towards becoming more liberal, in the sense that, again, the access is more open, more people can get elected, younger people with more genuine popularity, grassroots support, or it is moving in the direction of more managed, technical, essentially campaign management techniques, where everything is under control. So I think this election is, in a way, peaked as probably the most managed that I have seen so far. The Kremlin has been incredibly successful, I think, in achieving almost everything they wanted at this election. They kept the turnout low. They got all the governors they wanted elected, and the governors are the most important figures, and the governors are popular figures. They do have a connection to the population, to the citizens. People very often in many regions identify with their region, and kind of they know the name of their governor. They know they interact with the local politics and local events. So the governors are super important, and the Kremlin has been able to get all the governors they wanted sort of confirmed. I wouldn't say elected, but essentially acclimated as new governors again. I think that the process has been for the past years essentially that politics has been driven out of the procedures, out of the institutional procedures. The elections essentially are devoid of politics. Politics happens somewhere else. For the Kremlin, it's absolutely important that politics does not happen in the streets. Demonstrations, rallies are a problem. It always, from the Kremlin's point of view, it means that something's wrong, and somebody else is controlling the political process, not the Kremlin. So essentially what we are seeing is that the political management in Moscow is becoming more convinced, sure of themselves as electoral managers, as political managers. They achieve more, and they're completely sure that this is how politics happens. This is how it should be done. Everything should be predetermined. The figures selected through some opaque, completely intransparent process go through this public procedure and get essentially appointed or acclimated, if we use this, word from the essentially medieval ways of, Republican, all the Republican practices of, when people were shouting the name of, essentially goes back to the ancient, ancient democracies. So we see that this is essentially a success. The question, the success for the Kremlin, the question remains, where and at what point real politics will jump out of the box. What I've been seeing for the past years is that essentially political managers have been pushing the lid on the cooker, on this powder keg that is politics, closer, tighter and tighter, and they've been successful at that. The question is when it comes out, and it has not so far. Apparently there are no triggers, or people are not interested, and I will, for example, I can quote one of the takeaways from the book that a colleague of ours, Sam Green, just recently published, I think last year, Putin versus the People. They've analyzed and they made in-depth conversations with people in Russia who were active politically. One of the takeaways is that people in Russia divide not in the sense that some think that everything is great and they vote for Putin, and others think that everything is bad and they vote against Putin or Kremlin-appointed candidates. The divide is between the people who think that everything's not particularly good and they believe in politics and they think that things can be changed through a political process. And those who think that things also are not good, they just don't believe in politics. They don't see how any political process can change that. And the latter, those who don't believe in politics, they're just a majority. There are more of them than those who are naive enough to join real political movements like Alexei Navalny's movement, and then face a disillusionment after a number of attempts and realize that no, things cannot be changed. So this is kind of existential, I think, that the Kremlin strengthened and entrenches in its belief that politics only exists as a managed process, meticulously controlled from A to Z, that everything should be managed, everyone should be selected, and then open to the public, as a sort of a theatrical performance of these elections. And then there is this minority of Russians who still, for all kinds of reasons, think that a political process is something else. And I think that this year we've unfortunately moved closer to the Kremlin's understanding of politics, a little bit farther away from more grassroots, chaotic and sort of democratic understanding of politics that probably still exists in somebody's understanding of how things are changed in a country. But I will just conclude by saying that probably we just we have to be honest and with ourselves and understand that that's where we are. This year has not brought a change in the kind of direction that people like myself, for example, has been hoping for. And we just have to analyze and analyze the results and see if there are any signs of the things trending in the other direction. I, quite frankly, see very few of them. And just to be on it, to end it on a happy note, I would just say that, yes, of course, the results in Novosibirsk and Tomsk and Tambov are great. And this means that in Siberia, Novosibirsk and Tomsk, in Siberia, people are able to act, especially in Novosibirsk, create coalitions, act in concert with each other, create collective movements, which is incredible, which is something that is, I think, for foreign audience, for everyone outside of Russia, I cannot stress it strongly enough. It's very, very difficult to act collectively in a place like Russia, in a place like Iran, in a place like China, where any collective action is punishable. So whatever happens, it under more in a different environment, that would be 10 times, probably 100 times more. So the things that happened in Novosibirsk and Tomsk mean that the Russian public, the Russian society is actually able to think politically in that non-Kremlin way. It's just a sign of things to come. Let's hope for that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Max, and to all three of you. Again, a reminder, email kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet to Kennan Institute, or post on Facebook for questions. Let me start, though, with this question and ask you guys to get outside the box of the present a little bit. It seems to me when we analyze, or when we debrief or handicap the success or failure of any election in Russia, our basis of comparison implicitly is Western democratic elections, or is some kind of abstract future notion of elections in a democratic Russia. After all, if you go the other direction on the sliding scale towards less democracy, then you don't even have to have elections. In other words, the point of comparison of an election is lost. So what I'd like to invite you to do is speculate or perhaps recount for us an actual real case in the history of this country. Maybe it was in late Soviet times, perestroika. Maybe it was the Zemstvos of the late 19th century. Maybe it was the 1990s, when you saw something like a flourishing of democracy on a local level expressed through elections. Explain to us what that might look like as a basis of comparison, to the extent that that's real. That's actual Russians engaging in actual electoral democracy on a local level. I think that would be very helpful to me and probably also to others who are trying to understand, against what are we comparing these recent Putin local elections. Does anybody want to try to tackle that, or is it an unfair question?
Nikolai?
Go ahead, Max.
Well,
yeah,
okay,
sure.
I'll try. I don't have a very good answer, Matt. Well, there is this basic fact about Russia, that power has never changed hands in an election in Russia. It just never happened. So political decisions are made outside of the public view and then presented to the public. And television is probably the best symbol, kind of conduit for the kind of politics that, well, the way the Kremlin understands politics. They understood it this way long before television appeared, but it's one way. It's this communication. Something happens behind the screen. Then there is an anchor who appears on your screen and just lets you know how things should be. And in fact, we know very little about those people who are Russian politicians, including Vladimir Putin. Well, he to a certain extent, yes, he is a popular figure, but I don't have really an answer. Has he ever been elected, really? But everyone else certainly has never been elected. So these people could have been actors. They just could be, you know, it could be a sitcom, a show. They just come on screen and screen and tell you, you know. So in that sense, it's kind of pretty pessimistic. But on the other hand, there are lots of signs that the Russian public is quite able to get together, to think about their life, their common interests. Whenever they can, it happens. Whenever there is an event or a cause that gets people's attention focused, this happens immediately, just like this. It's landfills, for example. Ecological problems are one of those. This happens in multiple regions. People immediately get together. There are local leaders emerging, and then the political management from Moscow starts to deal with this, and they very often are able to dissolve it, to wait it out, to make sure no significant consequences follow. But we have seen a lot of cases where people have been able to change, to make a difference. In Ekaterinburg, in Arkhangelsk, with the landfill, in Ekaterinburg, with the cathedral that was supposed to be built on a piece of land that people wanted to keep as a park. And there are numerous other occasions of grassroots movements emerging and achieving results. Very often not through an election, simply because an election from the Kremlin's point, it's like, essentially, it's what they do. They manage the election, that's their business. And they're good at it. So they normally prevent everyone from changing things, from making a difference through an electoral mechanism. But people are able to do it through other mechanisms. And to me, this is a sign, and it's something that I think means that the Russian public is just like any other public in any other country in the world, is able and willing to effect change through collective action.
So, Max, your answer seems to suggest that the pageant of an election really is just that it's sort of beside the point. I would push back, and Regina, I see you on mute, so I'm going to come to you next, but I would push back and suggest that it's been almost universal in societies in transition that when the opportunity arises to organize locally, that organizing often takes the form of something that looks like an election. It might not be a sort of perfect political science definition of it, but essentially it's taking the pulse of the majority of the people, and an election is a very efficient way to do that. But it's interesting you say when Russians solve problems through grassroots action, just like from the top down, it happens outside the context of an election.
Yes.
Regina, please go ahead.
So to go to your historical analogy, I was really lucky to be in St. Petersburg a lot in the late 1980s, where you saw very much a sort of, not some collective action, but coordination, that people wanted something different. And there were very smart opposition politicians who were giving them choices, even in the elections. And I would also go to, I spent a lot of time in the regions in the 1990s, and there were lots of politics going on in the regions in the 1990s. Candidates were really good politicians. They were reaching out to define their electorates. There were lots of controls. There was by no means a clean or fair race, but there was an awful lot of politics happening out in the regions, and even in the urban regions with gubernatorial machines, which is its own sort of politics. So I think even in the very recent past, we don't have to go back to 1905 or even 1916 to see sort of contestation and a really intelligent, smart, creative response to opportunities.
Kolya, do you want to get in on this one? Go ahead.
Okay, I would say that Max is absolutely right when saying that never in contemporary Russian history the fate of the country has been decided in elections. But we should look at least three different levels when speaking about elections. In case of the federal level, the first and the last more or less free and fair election took place in 1991. It was the presidential elections. And the reason why is that time position of the president of Russia was nothing. So it wasn't about real power. Yeltsin did manage to win that time. But at the regional level, I would say that in course of 90s, elections looked very competitive and very interesting. And in many cases, the Kremlin and the Kremlin-backed candidates were losing. What was going on before Putin has switched first to appointment of governors and then to elections with municipal filter, it was a kind of negative selection. Unlike now, the Kremlin was pushing out of the race those candidates who would be dangerous for the Kremlin, leaving those who are acceptable. And there could be very intensive competition between those guys, and whoever was winning, he could conclude a deal with the Kremlin. What we see now, I think, it's absence of any real competition in gubernatorial elections at the federal level. And to illustrate this fact, I would say that out of almost 150 gubernatorial races since the system announced the switch to direct gubernatorial elections in 2012, there were only 4 cases when the challenger did win against incumbent governor appointed by the Kremlin. In 2 of these cases, when really strong challengers did manage to win, they are not in place. It's Irkutsk and Khabarovsk, and only those 2 governors who appeared to be pretty weak are still able to sit in their offices. But what we see at the municipal level can be quite different. Not only this is Moscow municipal elections in 2018, but even now we've seen pretty interesting races at the municipal level, because municipal elections is about nothing, and the Kremlin does not pay any serious attention to what's going on. But my last point is that the system, the political regime in Russia is very different from what it used to be. And this, transformation happened in 2014, and especially after annexation of Crimea. And one of the very important features of the current regime is that legitimacy is not coming from the bottom up. It's distributed from the top down. So the system, the regime is legitimate due to high Putin's popularity, and his legitimacy is transferred to governors, through governors to regional and municipal deputies and elsewhere. That's why the Kremlin now not only is not interested in competitive elections. Competitive elections are dangerous for the Kremlin because they can create legitimate leaders, being them governors or even regional deputies, who are legitimate due to popular support, not due to the fact that it's Putin, it's the Kremlin who did back then. That's why last more or less competitive elections at regional level, if not to speak about these 4 cases, when we've seen a kind of protest voting. It wasn't real political competition. The last case of real political competition was 2013 in Moscow mayoral elections when Alexei Navalny came the second with 27% of votes. And that time it was real campaign. It was evident, it was very intensive. Crowds were engaged into this campaign. There were a lot of places in Moscow where, well, agitation was going on. So it was really a very interesting political game in town, the last one.
So I want to take up this point of legitimacy and also Navalny and his strategy as essentially the symbol or the figurehead leader of the only genuine non-systemic opposition in Russia. But there's an element that troubles me a little bit, and I wonder, we'll make this the last question and invite each of you to comment on this and wrap up. I see a trend towards the blurring of substantive, you could say ideological lines among all of the opposition to United Russia, which includes at one end of the spectrum, you know, parties like Rodina, the Communist Party, you know, LDPR, very conservative nationalist parties. Some have even said Navalny has this kind of strain to him. But then at the other end of the spectrum, also, you know, kind of liberal critics of the regime, liberal opposition. And I wonder if one of the effects of the protest voting or the smart voting hasn't been to give a kind of legitimacy to what you would hope in their extreme nationalism and intolerance would be somewhat fringe views in any nation's politics. That in essence, if there is ever going to be a moment for a free election, whether it's local or national, that the natural candidate or party to rise to the top is now going to be more conservative and more nationalist than it would have otherwise been. Do you see that as a problem? And also, how do you see the long-term impact of the kind of narrower and narrower space within which political opposition has to operate?
I would say that there is very intensive discussion going on in the liberal camp with regard to smart voting. So Navalny's approach is to find a candidate who is capable to win against the candidate of, say, the United Russia, being he a communist, being he nationalist, or anybody else. This is very political approach about consolidating forces against the major enemy. The other camp is saying that we should practice moral approach, and we should not combine our efforts with those who are bad guys, with nationalists, with communists. We should combine our forces with only those who are sharing our liberal, our democratic views. And unfortunately, although I do have sympathy with regard to this second camp, and it's widespread in Yabloko, for example, I would say that it brings them to the margin, it brings them to the electoral ghetto, and the only way to go out is to fight against the major enemy, and then to think about all differences in our political views, in our positions, and so on. This is exactly what Alexei Navalny is doing, and this is exactly what he is blamed for. But I would say that we should not be that pessimistic with regard to, say, forthcoming Duma elections, because now I think the role of regional political elites, not necessarily of those governors who are sent by the Kremlin from Moscow to manage regions, but of proper regional elites, including business elites, will be bigger than even in previous elections. So we should wait that the natural result of weakening of the very archaic, very old-fashioned, very ineffective party system and switch by the Kremlin to single mandate races will lead to more pluralism, will lead to bigger representation of regional interests, and in that way it will make Russian politics more sophisticated than it looks now.
I don't know, Nikolai, that sounds like a long and winding road to optimism. I hope there's a real roadmap. Regina, how about I come to you on this, and also more broadly, I mean, you study the ways that elections evolve and people's attitudes towards them evolve in authoritarian systems. Do you see a path forward whereby there's actually space for what we would consider to be a normal spectrum of political views in competitive politics, or has Russia, as was so often the case in Russia's history, has the dominance of one view kind of set the table for the long term of Russia's future?
Yeah, I'm a political scientist. You just broke my head. Navalny, let me say here that first of all, Navalny's picking people. He's not picking parties, and he's very carefully picking those people. And so he's not quite covering the spectrum in Smart Vote that you suggest. The second thing I want to say is there is signs, at least in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that Smart Vote candidates, even from the Communist Party or other parties, continue to be in dialogue. So there's a process of dialogue and change that happens. That's a very small scale, but it's a very smart scale. I don't think smart voting is entirely out there to demonstrate or to just have anybody but united Russia. It's to show people that if they engage and coordinate, they can make a change, a small change. It's a preparation, just as the regime is preparing for 2021, so is the opposition. And so here we're saying, okay, if we have some big wins, they become really important signals that change is possible. And I think this is more an information campaign than an electoral component of the campaign. That's what I think the strategy is about. I want to reiterate that I don't think that this election tells us anything about Russian people's opinions, that it's too controlled. It was far too controlled, sterilized. We're all searching for language. We need new language about how to describe this, what happened. But I don't think it tells us anything about people. But I do know that Russians are conservative in the sense that they don't want big change. And so it seems unlikely that they'll push to the extremes if given the choice. They'll elect people that are familiar to them. They'll elect people that have local reputations. They'll elect successful businessmen. So I'm not as concerned about that pushing to the edge as you seem to be.
Great, thank you. Max, I'm going to give you the last word if you want to comment on this or anything else. But I also want to pick up with this final question on what Regina said about just, you know, how unimportant or not telling this is, except as a kind of communications exercise and signaling with respect to the 2021 Duma elections, and ask you, what should those of us who watch Russian domestic politics be watching in the year or so between now and that election? You're muted, Max.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So what Alexei Navalny has started is what they call smart voting. it's actually an international phenomenon. It's called tactical voting. It happens everywhere. It happens in the United States as well, by the way, when people realize that it's important to vote for either of the two, not for the third candidate, because if you vote for the third candidate, whoever that might be, you essentially are wasting your vote. So this is very technical. And Navalny's message here is that there are no ideology. There's no ideology in Russia. Ideology or real politics is not involved in the election. The Kremlin has completely, it's devoid of politics. So the only thing that we can do, Navalny says, is to play just like they do, being technical. They manage the election, we break that management, we break that mechanism. And the only way they found is to try and coordinate the vote so that people vote for whoever there is, who is the least of the evils, because there are no real candidates. And they say it. Leonid Volkov, who's Alexei Navalny's campaign manager, and he's running the organization actually, he's saying this, that you have to think about it differently. There are no ideologies, there are no politics here. It's all about who is the least terrible of all those no names who are on the ballot. Just let's coordinate and vote for this X, Y, or Z, simply because that will break the system. And this potentially is very effective, and probably we will see more of it. But of course, it's completely devoid of meaning, of political substance, and it's taking politics away from thinking in terms of values. It's kind of post-value thing, and I don't know what to do with this. I'm not sure that this is how you continue. So this is a way to break down the system, but it's not a way to build a new one, because I don't think this will ever change. But people do live and think and believe in certain values, and so this will take over at some point. This will happen. It's just a matter of time. And we're living through a process, through a time in Russia's history where we have this political process that's completely sterile, completely devoid of any substance, and on purpose. That's what they've been doing for years. They've been trying to drench it of any meaning, any connection to any values, anything. And that's been done from the Kremlin top down. And now we have a movement in Russia, the only real political opposition that we have, Alexei Navalny's organization, who are hitting against that with essentially also this kind of tool, very technical, aiming at breaking the machine rather than winning a political game, because under the circumstances, this is not possible. So basically, to conclude, I think that we are, like, in a way, in a very dark place, in the sense that politics is devoid of substance, devoid of values, but they do exist. They live in other places. The Kremlin has been able to clean, sterilize, sanitize the electoral process, but there are lots of other places where it does exist. There are media, there are causes that people care about, there are figures, there are popular leaders that tend to attract attention. So things happen, and my understanding is that change will come from those other places, not from where the Kremlin is super prepared, and it's like winning a game you can win, you cannot win, you cannot compete with the government, with a state in using violence and using force. The state is always stronger, and that's the same in Russia. It's the same in elections. In elections, the Kremlin is always stronger, but there are other ways, and this is where life goes on, and people are changing, and generational change, by the way, is happening. People now are active who were born in the 80s, and it's a big generation in Russia, the biggest one, bigger than those who were born like myself in the 70s, and they will take over eventually.
Well, thanks very much, Max. That's also a note of optimism, but certainly a long-term one. I want to thank all three of you. I'm reminded by the notion that politics, values, ideas all exist outside the framework of elections, which is certainly true. To call your attention to a recent Canon X podcast, which is a discussion between our own Jill Doherty and Ksenia Sobchak, the former presidential candidate, celebrity, and many other things, about the idea of political correctness in Russian public life. And certainly that's not a debate that happens from the podium of campaigning, but it apparently is happening now in Russian television and other places. So a good example, maybe not the most weighty one. I thank all of you again for your thoughts, and look forward to talking again in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.